An introduction to the Spring MVC framework. As a Java developer, you likely understand the power and flexibility of the Spring framework. One of the most useful modules in the Spring framework is the Spring MVC framework. It provides a robust architecture and configuration for building web applications. In this article, you'll get an overview of the Spring MVC framework and how it can help you develop complex web applications. The Spring MVC framework is a request-based framework built on the Spring framework that helps you create flexible and loosely coupled web applications. It implements the Model View Controller (MVC) architecture beautifully and helps you build web applications in a structured and organized way. With Spring MVC, you can leverage the full power of the Spring framework to build web applications rapidly. In this introduction to Spring MVC, you'll learn about the core components of the Spring MVC framework: configuration, request processing, lifecycle, and more. You'll see examples and understand how to put the pieces together to build a simple web application using Spring MVC. By the end of this article, you'll be ready to start building your own web applications with the robust and scalable Spring MVC framework. What is Spring MVC framework? The Spring MVC framework is a robust, flexible web framework built on top of the Spring framework. It follows the Model View Controller (MVC) architecture, allowing you to build scalable web applications. Spring MVC lets you create web applications and RESTful web services. It is one of the most popular web frameworks for Java, and includes the following main components. Dispatcher Servlet acts as the front controller, intercepting requests and dispatching them to controllers. Controllers handle incoming requests and return a model and view. Controllers use services to delegate business logic. Model holds data that will be rendered in the view. View renders the model data, typically in HTML. View technologies like JSP, TimeLeaf, and FreeMarker are supported. Handler mappings map incoming requests to controller methods. View resolvers resolve view names to actual view implementations. Handler interceptors intercept certain requests before they reach the controller. To build an application with Spring MVC, you need the Spring Web MVC dependency. Then you configure Dispatcher Servlet in your web.xml file, along with a context parameter specifying the location of an MVC configuration file. In the MVC configuration file, you define beans like controllers, view resolvers and handler mappings. You also map requests to controllers using the @request mapping annotation. With powerful and flexible features like these, it's no wonder Spring MVC has become the go-to web framework for enterprise Java. Spring MVC architecture and workflow. The Spring MVC framework follows the Model View Controller (MVC) architecture pattern. It helps in building flexible and loosely coupled web applications. The Dispatcher Servlet acts as the front controller and handles all incoming requests. It dispatches requests to the appropriate controllers. Controllers contain the business logic for the request. They handle requests from the Dispatcher Servlet and load the model data needed for the request. The model contains the data that will be rendered in the view. It acts as a data carrier between controllers and views. Views are responsible for rendering the model data and returning a response to the client. They use technologies like JSP, HTML, and CSS to render the Data. To understand the workflow, consider an example request to get employee details. The client sends a request to get details of an employee with ID 123. The dispatcher servlet receives the request and forwards it to the appropriate employee controller. The employee controller loads the employee data from the database and adds it to the model. It returns the name of the view to render. The response. The dispatcher servlet finds the view and renders it with the model data. The rendered view is returned as a response to the client. By separating concerns into the model, view, and controller, Spring MVC enables loose coupling and easier testing and maintenance of web applications. The framework's configurable components also provide flexibility and extensibility. For developers setting up Spring MVC, to set up Spring MVC, you'll need to configure a dispatcher servlet in your web application. The dispatcher servlet acts as the front controller in the Spring MVC framework, responsible for routing requests to handler mappings and returning a model and view.